Hello and welcome to Biblical Justice A to X. If you're joining us in the live audience, please be sure to close your other computer programs for the best audiovisual experience. Global Justice is pleased to present to you Biblical Justice A to X each month as a video conference to review key justice issues ranging from abortion to xenophobia. This month, we're focusing on the timely and important topic of religious freedom. My name is Sosma Samuel Burnett, and I'm the founder and president of Global Justice, and I'll be serving as your moderator for this session. I'm particularly pleased to be joined today by two expert panelists, Derek Martin and David Llewellyn. Hi, Derek, and hi, David.
Hello, Sosma.
Well, before we get into this discussion, gentlemen, I want to take a moment for our audience to get to know the two of you. So let me start with you, Derek. Would you just give us a brief introduction of who you are and the work that you do?
Absolutely. I am a professional artist in the area of theater. I have been a professional director, actor, dancer, choreographer, producer for the last 20 to 25 years. I currently work at William Jessup University in the Department of Creative Arts, and I am the director of the theater program.
So what don't you do over there, Derek? That's great. Wonderful range of activity. And David Llewellyn, would you share a little bit about your background for us as well?
I'm a civil rights lawyer and a former law professor at Trinity Law School, Chapman Law School. Taught a couple of courses at William Jessup University, focusing primarily on religious liberty, constitutional rights, international human rights, and issues that affect Christians when they try to live out their faith in the public sphere.
That's wonderful. And I'll add that at one point you were referred to as God's lawyer for the range of religious freedom cases you've been involved in.
Yeah, the State Bar publication did a review of me at one time and said that. I don't know whether they intended that to be a compliment or a smirk, but that's what they said.
Well, we'll take it as the compliment. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. And I'd like to just dive right in to our questions. So the first question is, let's look at this issue called religious freedom. You know, people have different reference point on what it means. But maybe, David, I can have you start us off. What does it mean when we say religious freedom?
Well, religious freedom is the freedom to believe and hold and express your beliefs about fundamental realities. And one of the uniquenesses of Christianity, for example, is that Christianity believes in religious freedom. That is, even for people who do not believe in Christianity. And that's different from many of religions who think that they're exclusive. But Christianity believes in separation of church and state. Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And that people have the right to be wrong. And from a Christian point of view, it's a right to be eternally wrong, and it's very, very dangerous. But they have that freedom of choice, and the difficulty is that many other competing philosophies and ideologies are exclusive, and they do not want to permit people to have differing belief systems side by side with theirs, and that creates the problems of religious liberty.
Great. And, you know, just as a follow-up, I know for some, they think of religious freedom as sort of, you know, freedom of worship. So you're really talking about something much broader than freedom of worship. It's really that belief system and the freedom to be able to think and to believe what you want to believe, correct?
Yeah, secularists and people who are opposed to religious liberty want to confine religious liberty to freedom of worship only. They want to put it into a private sphere where in your home, or possibly in some churches, but even in some cultures you can't even have a church, so that they can isolate it so that it won't try to affect the values of the broader culture. But Jesus claims that he's Lord of all, and it's appropriate and even required of believers to express their faith in public because it's a public benefit. People will have better lives if they're aware of this information, and they are being deprived if it is silenced. So putting it inside a church only or inside the home only is inconsistent with actual religious liberty and true Christianity.
Well, that might be a great segue for us to also bring Derek into the conversation. So Derek, understanding this broader idea of religious freedom, we often refer to religious freedom as a foundational right. All kinds of other rights extend from it. So obviously the right to believe can also extend to expressing that belief, and that expression can come in many forms, and certainly artistic forms. So could you touch on that a little bit in terms of what religious freedom means in that sort of expressive context?
Absolutely. Well, I first think that the religious freedom is the cornerstone freedom. From my perspective, as I see it, it gives our ability to believe anything. That's what it breaks down as, what does it mean to believe? And I think everything we do comes out of beliefs and values. From an expression perspective, having the freedom to express has been a long-held important part of America. It's not that way in certain other cultures, and certain other religions kind of ban that. But in America, there's been the ability to express yourself freely in whatever way that may be. Artists specifically have used that to encourage social change, to enlighten people about ideas and thoughts that may be countercultural. And when we're dealing with religious freedom or potential challenges to religious freedom, there are many more complex things that can happen culturally that I'm not convinced everyone's seeing the entire side of this. How will this affect what an artist is able to express if we start breaking down the ability to how we view beliefs, or how the government starts to allow us to view our beliefs?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, as sort of a related piece, if you have certain restrictions, it also restricts how you are able to express your art, right? So if there are parameters put on various ways of believing, then it also affects how you're able to express your art, and also how you conduct yourself as an artist, right? In terms of what your principles and value system are.
Absolutely. I think from my perspective, my ability to create the productions that I've been a part of, the artist, I'm also a musician, and I've done other kinds of artists. I'm not just a singular theater artist, but I've been involved in many different types of art. The cornerstone of faith being at the center of my creation only enlivens the creation and the creative process itself. And I have seen the kind of content, the kind of ideas that are coming out, or taking a piece that, in theater, for instance, we often will take a piece that's already been produced and reproduce it, but allowing it to filter through the lens of faith can sometimes illuminate certain truths, deep embedded truths in all humans, that can come to the surface only through the eyes of faith. And I've seen it happen, and people will say, "What is it about that work?" And I'm not just trying to self-promote about my work, but I'm saying people who have a strong established faith and allow that to live and breathe through their work, it starts to open the door to really positive questions. It may lead to someone believing and opening the door to faith. It may just open the door to healing, or to other really important things that come along with faith being at the center of what you do.
Great, thank you. And David, I want to come back to you in a little different direction. Obviously, when we're talking about religious freedom, people would think of in terms of, religious perspective, the Bible, etc. But what makes this topic a biblical justice topic? Why is this a justice concern?
God is a God of justice. Micah says, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God?" That, in a sense, encapsulates the great commands. Jesus says to love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. You can't love your neighbor if you're acting unjustly towards your neighbor. So justice is implicit in religious liberty, and there's also an ultimate sense that there's a coming day of judgment for the world and for each individual. We don't live in a value-free universe, and God is eventually going to call us to account for our behavior toward God and toward others, and that puts justice in its ultimate context.
Hmm. You know, it's interesting, David. You know, we've had here in the United States a long history of the judicial system, you know, the justice system reviewing religious liberty cases. And we know that there's a current one working its way into the U.S. Supreme Court. And December 5th is the date that we're expecting to hear the Masterpiece, Bakery case being heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. Could you speak to that a little bit in this context of biblical justice?
Yeah, it's quite a fascinating case. It's the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Human Rights Commission, and it's a man named Jack Phillips has for over 20 years has built cakes. He names his shop this because he's an artist, as Derek would say, with his cakes. He draws them artistically, he lays them out, he puts the themes on them, he designs and decorates them in a way to express the shared beliefs of the couple being, we're talking particularly about wedding cakes in this case, the couple being married, and his own religious beliefs about the sanctity of marriage and how important that is. And he ran into a problem because a gay couple, two men, came into his shop and asked him to do a cake for their wedding, even though gay marriage was not yet legal in Colorado at the time. Just kind of a footnote on the case, but he declined, saying that he doesn't do that sort of thing. He doesn't promote anything in his cakes. He doesn't do cakes for Halloween, for example, because he doesn't think that's an appropriate holiday. And he closes his shop on Sundays. He's committed to a religious worldview in his artistic expression in cake making. And they sued him before the Colorado Human Rights Commission. They lost. They appealed to the Colorado Court of Appeals and lost. And the legal decisions against them basically said, there's no artistic right here. There's no free speech right. You're not being compelled to use your creative powers to promote same-sex marriage, as you claim. You're not being compelled to say things against your conscience, as you claim. You're simply being told that you must sell them a cake. And if you look at the news reports of this, you get the impression that he refused to sell cakes to people because of their sexual orientation. Not true. He always sold people, no matter what their philosophy was or sexual orientation. He was willing to sell them products, but to make a cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding when he thinks that's contrary to the laws of God and is certainly contrary to his understanding of the laws of God and his conscience, that is a violation. And he's asked the Supreme Court to acknowledge this, and I think he's absolutely correct. And happily, because of the changes in the U.S. administration, the Department of Justice filed an amicus brief on his side of the case, recognizing that there's a free speech right against viewpoint discrimination and compulsory speech and artistic expression at issue here. And even law professors who oppose him on the same-sex marriage question support him on the free speech question in this case.
Great, thank you for that summation. And Derek, I want to bring you into this too, because as David's described, there's sort of two prongs to this particular case. There's religious freedom outright, but there's this idea of this artistic expression. This is an artist. He expresses his art by the creation of these cakes. That's a unique expression that he has. And so, how do you feel about this this case and what that might mean for artists in general, and what's required of artists in terms of what they're allowed or forced to do?
Yeah, I think it's a tenuous in a very challenging subject. I think it comes down to, there's this question almost like I keep hearing, I've heard it from some friends who fall on the other side of the camp when it comes to this, who just says, a business doesn't have morals. Business is not allowed morality. Then I go, but then an artist is their business. They're a singular person, but they still will accept a singular person has morality. So then you have this conflict of interest going on here. Artists promote anti-religious sentiments as a regular practice, just to break free from what they consider bondage or what is oppressive. Occasionally there's some oppressive things that have gone on, and turn during the Holocaust, there were certain Jewish artists that were, anti what was going on in Germany and used the art to actually promote understanding and trying to solve, get to the deeper core of that issue. I think that if we open this can of worms and we start to have government decide what you can and cannot express, what you can and cannot believe, or the way that belief comes about, it's opening a can of worms, and it's not just opening it in terms of the Christianity thing. I think that's an important thing, is that when you open this can of worms, it's going to affect freedom of expression across the board. Right. And then, how do we then move forward? That's my big issue, is I'm saying I don't know then, does it give us any freedoms at all? Because once one breaks down, what then can I express without someone else being able to tell me what's going on, or a government being able to intervene? And then are we a free country? And that becomes challenging.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is, obviously we're talking about this particular case because it's going before the U.S. Supreme Court, but there are many other cases with, sort of similar scenarios or different scenarios, but a lot of the same issues involved. And so one of the things I wanted to touch on is the fact that a lot of times in the public, this particular case is expressed as sort of anti-gay or anti-same-sex, but really the issue is about that expression, right? And that it can come in other forms. So if it didn't involve, let's say, two same-sex individuals, but maybe it was something that was a different religious perspective, how would people have received that, and would that change any of this? David, could you speak to that a little bit? I mean, if we change the facts slightly, would these same issues be equally of concern to us?
The briefs in this case do look at that issue. So, for example, if you're a Native American bake shop and you have to do a Columbus Day cake, and you think that a Columbus Day is a symbol of everything is bad in the country, right or wrong, that's your opinion. Should you be required to do that because that's ethnic discrimination if you refuse to do that? Curiously, as a result of this Masterpiece Cake Shop case, at least three other people in Colorado tried to test the reaches of the law by going to gay bakeries and asking them to bake cakes with anti-gay representations on them, with quotes from Leviticus 18 and different kinds of things. It was pretty upfront about it. And when they refused, as they did, they sued them before the Colorado Human Rights Commission, and the Colorado Human Rights Commission said, no, they were allowed to refuse because the messages were offensive to the bakers.
Right.
But they were not allowed to refuse when the message was a religious message, which was offensive to the Christian. So there is an inequality going in here, which I think Derek suggested. It cuts both ways. But in the current milieu of our culture, it cuts mainly against people who believe in natural law and traditional Christianity.
Well, it's a troubling, set of circumstances, certainly, and I think both of you touched on a lot of the details related to the case, and also, in terms of what it means for our country and for people who are either running businesses or who are artists, etc. But I want to broaden our discussion a little bit and also talk a little bit more globally. Obviously, this case is going to affect a number of other cases in the U.S., but it's also being watched by people in other places, and religious freedom is a main concern in many regions of the world. Religious oppression exists at a much higher level in other parts of the world. So maybe, Derek, I can have you just sort of start off, give us a little sense of what this topic means from an international perspective from your area.
Sure. Well, it's what I find fascinating is when you look at other cultures, when we study other cultures, the primary reason we know history is through the artifacts left behind from other cultures. When we go into other cultures, if we're going to some third world countries and are studying some indigenous tribes and other kinds of things like that, oftentimes we will study their cultural product, and it's interesting that the freedom of expression is tied directly to what they believe, who they are, and very often in other cultures you'll find that artistry and religious freedom are tied. They couldn't be separated if you tried. For instance, even in a third world country, if you go to a third world country and they are doing certain sort of fertility dances, rain dances, other kinds of things, they wear masks, they have certain costumes, certain paint. Their artistry actually, the freedom to express and the freedom of their religion comes through that expression entirely. So I see this as to separate the two seems so it's so strange to me, because they're so intrinsically entwined. What we express is directly tied entirely to what we believe and how we live that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that, it's interesting that historically a lot of the art that we see around the globe does have a connection to religion of some sort, and that sometimes when there are conflicts, the first place that they go to in those conflicts is destroying the artifacts. You've seen that in terms of terrorist attacks. Oftentimes terrorist attacks happen at churches and against artifacts that represent a religious or cultural perspective. We've seen that in many places, ISIS and Palmyra and places like that. So, really interesting that you brought that up. And David, let me also ask you, when you look at this idea of religious freedom, and you outlined earlier in our discussion, what its significance is, what does that mean for us internationally? What does that mean globally?
Well, there are two forces worldwide in operation, primarily, perhaps three, depending on how you look at it. But we've been talking about essentially the left progressivism, postmodernism, which is post-Christian culture in Europe, and increasingly in the United States, although the United States is somewhat unique, partly because we had separation of church and state very early on, and Christianity in Europe did not have separation of church and state, and consequently they have a different set of issues. But Europe is largely post-Christian, and then 50-plus nations of the world, of course, are Islamic. So you have a pincer movement, as it were. You have post-Christian Western culture impinging on Christianity because they're opposed to all natural law and all constraints of every kind. They think freedom is an end-all in itself. And then you have precisely the opposite worldview in Islamic worldview, and especially in the jihadist version of Islamic worldview, in which there is only one acceptable perspective, and the others are so incompatible as to not be even allowed to be expressed in the culture with religious liberty, and frequently actually result in imprisonment and death. Then you have the other things like secularist cultures like North Korea, in which Christianity is banned because of secularism, and the old Maoist China, and Christianity is banned largely in China, although it has an underground resurgence which is quite strong. And then you have South America, Central America, where a form of Catholic public Christianity persists, but it's lost most of its spiritual vitality. But there's no place, as Derek points out, there's no place in the world where there isn't religion. It's just that the religions are quite varied, and some of them, and they're incompatible with each other. So there are 3 or 4 versions of religion around the world that do not work out well together unless you believe in religious liberty.
Absolutely, and I guess to a large extent, it kind of depends on who's controlling government, isn't it? I think of my native country, which is India. Has always traditionally been very pluralistic, many religions, various religious sects. It's really a country in some ways. It's a model of pluralism, but things are changing. We have a Hindu government which has become progressively a little bit more oppressive against these other faiths, and so it's changing the nature of the country. And so I'm sure there's similar dynamics in other places, but as you've outlined, David, there's this extreme, there's this swing between the secular and the theocracy, and certainly we don't have a Christian model for a theocracy on this earth, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe Derek, I can bring that in. when we have systems or governance or requirements that are theocratic or even religiously secular, if you will, how do you handle that in terms of expression? Like, what do we do with that in these more oppressive cultures?
It's interesting because I look at I think it was, I could be right, but Danish, there was somewhere in Denmark where I believe the cartoonist kind of, did something with Muhammad, and then all of a sudden there was basically a jihad against that. It had to be taken down, and people are responding to this. As an artist in a free country, we kind of laugh, you kind of go, oh, that's ridiculous, but we have that freedom. We have that core freedom to be able to comment on even the government itself. Nothing is beyond getting commentary or being put a check or a balance being made. And I have found that as a creator, as a creative, oftentimes that is where a lot of the checks and balances happen on a grassroots level. You have the ability to speak into what a government is doing. If you're in an oppressive country, when we've talked to people who are in an oppressive country, either A, I find that they haven't realized it, well, they're part of that culture, that there is more freedom, and so there's a very dictatorial way that one expresses art and stuff. What's only until they get into more of a free culture that they realize the expression can change. And what's fascinating is they take the great parts about their culture and the way that they did art in that culture, and then it becomes it changes as they get the freedom to do it. They explore new, bring the good parts, the good tenets of the old, merge it with some new thought, and all of a sudden you're seeing a side of someone or a side of a particular religion or a side of a belief they never saw before, simply because it was someone was released from the shackles of oppression, and released to be able to create in a free society.
Very good point. And it is a different perspective depending on the type of society we're in. And so, David, you referenced this earlier about sort of the growth of, sort of Islam around the globe. And, not to point to Islam specifically, but there are branches of Islam that do become more extreme and do require, certain demands and limits on people. How do we introduce this idea of religious freedom into cultures and into religious perspectives that don't really allow for those freedoms, that don't really allow for pluralism? How do we reconcile this idea in those contexts?
I don't think you can do it through legal means alone. The United Nations and the international treaties, the international covenants on civil rights, and the various protocols have attempted, as you know, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all these things have attempted to preserve or to assert religious liberty, but with very little success outside of places which already recognized religious liberty. So I don't think that law will do it. It appears that Jesus had the way, that as you do it through love and service, as people open their minds, if at all, not always, but if at all, they open their minds when they see the difference in love and service and in tolerance and acceptance and even sacrifice on behalf of people who disagree with you. As Jesus said, to love your enemies. Well, that's unique. That's Judeo-Christian. That is not widely taught in other faiths. And when it's practiced, as rare as that is, but when it's practiced, it's very persuasive. It changed the Roman Empire, and it's capable of changing other cultures, but only at a great price. As the old, I think it was Tertullian, said, the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. People have to sacrifice. And very often, to switch back to the Masterpiece cake shop case, many people are suffering, and similar. There are about 24 cases of a similar nature around the country. I did one of the first cases, like in the country, 30 years ago. So people have been fighting this off and on for a long, long time. But eventually, it rises to the top, and someone makes a definitive decision. Hopefully, in favor of religious liberty, but along the way, other people have been serving the best interests of society and even their enemies and neighbors who disagree with them, and have been thereby persuading in a way that the legal system and the culture can't persuade.
Great. Thank you so much, David. We only have about a couple seconds left, gentlemen, and so I wanted to give you both just a moment to highlight a little bit of what you're currently working on before we close our session. Derek, tell us a little bit what you've been doing currently.
I just finished a production of Leslie Bercuse's Scrooge the musical, and gosh, it's when we're talking, it's just about allowing life to be spoken into the poor and the impoverished, and that whole story about redemption was great. So I'm working on that, and next we have coming up a production of The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sherlock Holmes. So
that's great. Great works, and more good things up ahead, I'm sure, into your expression. And David, tell us a little quickly about your work and what you're up to lately.
Well, my current project is putting together a lawsuit dealing with gender identity and gender pronouns and the compulsory speech and ideological coercion associated with them, not for people who are truly suffering from gender dystrophy, I guess it is, but rather for people who are using this as a cultural vehicle to try to destroy natural law and the family, and thereby transform society in a negative way.
Well, thank you both so much. Thank you for your valuable work in arts and law, and I also thank you for this discussion that we've had on religious freedom. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us today for Biblical Justice A to X. We hope you'll join us again next month for our next session, and you can follow this recording as well as the video guide for this session on our website at www.globaljusticeonline.org. Thank you.